Please stay tuned. We will be right back.
All right.
Hi, good morning, everyone. It's Friday, 9 a.m. Japan time, so it seems like a perfect time to start talking about sake and whiskey. Don't you think, Brian?
Yes, but not to drink it. It's too dark.
Not to drink it, not quite yet, but
Yeah.
it is happy hour somewhere. So someone might take our advice to heart and order something right now. Thank you so much for joining. Of course, this is Seeking Sustainability Live. We're focused on sustainability in terms of culture and environment and society. And I think sake and whiskey plays into that in so many different ways. So I'm really excited to talk to you about lots of different aspects that you have written about in your not one but two books on alcohol in Japan that have come up. So good on ya. Well done. Thanks for joining, Brian.
Well, thanks for having me.
Do you want to just start by quickly introducing yourself just a little bit?
Okay, so my name is Brian Ashcraft. I moved to Osaka in 2001. I still live in Osaka. I'm from Texas. My day job is writing for Kotaku.com, and I also write books and newspaper articles, and that's about it.
Awesome. Let's just briefly introduce Kotaku.com. I'm showing it on the screen right now. What kind of articles? A lot of pop culture, like pop Japanese culture.
Yeah, so I write a lot about pop culture in Japan, or game stuff, or anime stuff, all that sort of thing. Originally, I was a contributing editor at Wired magazine, and around 2005, I had done a big feature on absinthe, and at that time, absinthe was illegal in the United States. And I found this researcher who was reverse engineering old absinthe. So he'd get bottles of antique absinthe, stick a needle, through the cork in the bottle, extract a sample, run it through a GCMS,
Oh,
and was able to prove that absinthe wouldn't kill you, basically, because
wow.
because
Yeah, because it caused loads of problems, right? When it was legal.
well, that was not real absinthe. That was
Okay.
kind of industrial strength alcohol with a bunch of junk in it. But actual absinthe is it's an alcoholic drink, so there are obviously deleterious effects from that, but it's not going to make you cut off your ear or kill your family, like kind of the lore that had built around absinthe. And so I was really interested in alcohol production at the time and drink history. I'd studied art history in college. So if you go through, 19th century European art, you're going to talk about absinthe. So, and I was just interested with the intersect of history and culture with drinks. And then around that time, I started working on Kotaku, which took me in a totally, a different direction, lovely direction. So with these two books, it was nice to get back to talking about drinks, the culture of drinks, the history of these drinks, and that sort of thing.
That's awesome. We don't have much time, and we have two massive topics. So
Great.
let's dive right into the sake portion of our show.
Okay.
So
Sake.
how was it writing this book? I mean, you said it took you 2 years. Is that right?
Oh, it took longer than that.
Oh yeah.
It took longer than that. So the first sake brewery I went to was in '05, and you've probably experienced the same thing. But you walk into a sake brewery and you see rice, and then you drink sake, and it's like the world's greatest magic trick. It's like how do they do this? How do they how is this even possible? So I just remember the first time feeling that and really getting into sake. And so for this book, there's just went all over the place. We went to between me and my co-author, went to well over 150 breweries. breweries around the world. Out of those, I went to well over 100. So yeah, it was really intensive. It was easily kind of the most ambitious thing that I've tackled. And I guess before that, Japanese tattoos, I did a book on Japanese tattoos, and that had felt like it was the most ambitious thing because that's just visual history of Japan from the beginning of time. But this was, I mean, it's just a massive topic. There's so many breweries. There's so much sake. You can just spend your whole life exploring it and drinking it, and
Yeah, absolutely.
it's a huge topic.
Yeah. And a lot of the stuff that I picked up from your book, which is what I really love about sake, is that it's so connected to community, it's so connected to craftsmanship, it's
Right.
so connected to the environment in terms of using natural spring waters and using traditional methods to make casks. And I think the type of barrels, the industry, you also
Hmm.
talk about in whiskey as well. And I love all the artisanship of the process and the heritage of the style of it. and
Right.
and it's so important for rice culture as well. We have festivals, like you mentioned, we
Hmm.
have shrines, the religion, everything is connected to sake in some level. I thought that
Right.
was really beautifully done.
Oh, thank you. Yeah. So, I mean, like the cask stuff. Obviously, these are two totally different styles of cask. They're using two totally different kinds of wood. Um, but just the idea, and most people are brewing in enamel tanks, just because maybe they're looking for a certain flavor profile, and the upkeep on the wooden fermentation tanks is a lot more difficult. It's more involved. You have to keep them really, really clean. Um, so yeah, I mean, that kind of stuff was interesting. There was a lot of kind of crossover. I'm really interested in like wood and trees, and for the whiskey book, really interested in like grains and barley. And then this, obviously, talk a lot about rice. But the cool thing about sake is that there's a lot of technology, and there's always been a lot of technology. And so when people walk into, let's say the brewery museum at Hakutsuru, and they see all these old wooden things, like, oh wow, that's so traditional. Those are all machines. And so there's just been this long tradition in sake that brewers have been eager and willing to adopt new technology to make the process easier and better and all these things. And so for me, that's always, I used to write for Wired Magazine. I'm interested in technology. So that kind of, these intersects that are all coming in from different, there's obviously a hand where people are actually sticking their hands in the rice, but they're also using these machines, and they're developing new machines. And then you have this, you're out in a rice field talking to farmers, and just all these kind of different angles that you don't quite get in other industries. If we were talking about, I love cars. If we were talking about cars, we wouldn't be talking about a lot of this stuff. And you can drive a car, and that's great. You can't drink a car. So there's a wonderful ephemeral and pleasurable element about sake and whiskey as well, which I really like.
Yeah, and it's the culture of the landscape as well, which it brings me back to, I need to be drinking more local sake,
Yeah.
because we know that the amount of demand for rice is decreasing in Japan. People are eating more bread than rice, but the
Right.
sake industry is
Right.
using a lot of rice, and so
Right.
that is maintaining our beautiful landscapes. When we talk about the appeal of Japan's countryside, what would it be without sake having demand on the rice fields and the industry, right? So,
Especially now, I mean, with the coronavirus, there's this knock-on effect where uh, maybe home consumption is going up. And so I know probably myself, and maybe you as well, kind of feel at this point, maybe more now than ever, that because of the situation with the pandemic, I need to support my local breweries, the breweries that I really love. And so home consumption, while that's going up, bars and restaurant consumption is just falling off a cliff. And so that means that uh, there's going to be less rice contracted out. And so you're going to have farmers planting less rice. And it's just going to have, and that's going to drop production numbers. And it's just going to be this knock-on effect. And you're already seeing like Dasai, the famous brand. Dasai is selling premium Yamada Nishiki sake rice, and you can I guess buy it and eat it. But so yes, I agree. I mean, people should support their local breweries, especially now more than ever.
That was really interesting to me that there's sake rice and table rice, and some sake is actually made with table rice.
Right.
It's really interesting. And then years ago, Miho Imada, who is at Fukucho in Hiroshima area, a woman, a female toji, she was talking about it's very difficult to get organic rice, because I asked about that, and you covered that a little bit in your book as well.
Right. Yeah, it is, and it's if you go into an organic rice field, they look very different from ones that have used pesticides. The ones that have used, they're perfect. They just look absolutely spectacular. And for when you talk to a lot of farmers, people who have been growing rice for generations and who have been growing sake rice for brewers for generations, they'll say their job is to create a stable raw material like every single year. It cannot be, it cannot be unchanged, and they just need to, even if the weather's bad or whatever, they just need to have this reliability. So I think in that regards, they are hesitant to use pesticides. They don't want to. If they make a contract with the brewery, they want to be able to say, this is what we're giving you. For a lot of the organic rice, it's great, and I get it. You really see the impact of that in the price. It makes it much, much more expensive. So I can see why people do it, and I respect it. But it really just depends on I don't want to say like
no,
it just depends.
It's a scale thing, from what I've heard as well. Right. And we've gone and volunteered on organic rice farms and helped to push the weeds back in. And then they have ducks. So if you see ducks in a field, it's mostly organic, which is very interesting. And they say they grow organic for their own families. Right. But in terms of being able to sell it, they have to use chemicals to have the volume, right? Right. But then in your book, you also talked about the soil and how the sake industry is looking more deeply at the soil problems, which of course using pesticides would be bad for the soil. So in the terms of long term.
Well, I mean, the soil actually impacts the flavor. So you can take the same strain of rice and have it planted in the same we'll say the same prefecture, right? And then just different areas within that. And then the clay will be different. So you're going to get different, minerals coming in to influence the flavor. And then you can take these same, let's say, three or four different, rices that were grown in different areas, give them to the same brewery, and have them make the exact same thing. And if you line them up together, they taste different. And and it's one of those things where you think, oh, this is just nonsense. You really, but it's different. It's noticeably different. And that was one of the things for me that was so interesting, because when people talk about regionality and stuff like that in sake, some of it feels just like marketing. Some of it feels kind of like no, come on, but it does. The area that the rice is planted, those flavors do come through in the final rice, without a doubt.
I think with Stephen Lyman, we were talking about that with regional shochu as well in the shochu talk. and how certain areas growing the sweet potatoes and stuff, like you have very distinct flavors in different areas just because of the soil. That's really interesting to me.
Um, but I
Soil,
would,
so
yeah,
important. Yeah.
I would say this though. I think when we talk about regionality, if we lead like with kind of the intrinsic natural elements in which, for example, the rice is grown, I think that's incorrect. I think you actually have to lead with people. You have to lead with the humans, and I think that sake, as opposed to maybe some other alcoholic drinks, it's a series of decisions that are made by a brewer, master brewer, and each of these decisions impacts the final flavor of the sake. So you're not just, just because we use this rice, just because it's in this region, doesn't mean we're going to get this. It's not, A plus B equals C. You can get all sorts of stuff, and then regional flavors and trends, they change over time. So an easy example of this, if you say like Niigata, everybody has a very clear idea of what, this kind of very clean and crisp and uh, I would say somewhat watery. I mean, that sounds pejorative, but I don't mean a pejorative type of sake. But now that's changing. And if you go back 30 years, it was different as well. And they were brewing more into the style of like nada, they're, sweeter style of sake. So it changes over time. I mean, sake now is different from sake 100 years ago. It's different from sake 200 years ago. So it's constantly evolving. As the technology and trends and as we as people are changing, brewers then are trying to meet those. I think great brewers are trying to meet those changes as well, those trends, and trying to offer a very contemporary and modern drink. So I think that if we say like, sake is traditional, whatever, I think that it kind of hinders it from being modern. And I'd say a lot of sake is very cutting edge and very contemporary in many ways.
I want to touch on something you said, which I agree with 100% of any sake brewer that I've talked to or expert in the field. It really depends year on year on how well they do it and how it's very labor intensive. And they
Mm-hmm.
have to do certain things at certain temperatures at certain times and
Right.
sometimes stay up all night and stuff. And some of the brewers I've talked to said, when you've ruined it, when you've missed that 10-minute window when you didn't do something, that it's going to be a bad batch. And that's a really bad feeling.
But the cool thing
That's
though is like
incredible.
the cool thing is that you'll go in some breweries, and they'll have these high tech temperature controlled tanks, and they'll have an app on their phone, and they can just sit at home. They don't have to come in at night and kind of check it and keep an eye on it and say like, yes, as long as we're hitting these kind of these marks, it's going to be okay. So there's always been in sake a desire to make it better. How can we do this better? And that's why the technology for brewing has evolved. That's why that's why we're not using foot powered polishing machines anymore. You know what I mean?
Well, that's great because in so many industries in Japan, people are really stuck to the
Right.
traditional ways. So
Right.
I'm really happy to hear that they're accepting technology and accepting the new styles and trying to take it to the next level.
Well,
I found
just
this. Can I just
mhm,
mention this
mhm,
one point that you have in the
sure.
book about pasteurization?
Yeah.
That they actually discovered that pasteurization was being used in Japan before France. Like
Yeah.
they've been using it for ages, right?
Right. Yeah. I mean, the technique was used. I mean, earlier in Japan. That's correct. Yeah. Yeah. So I mean, just stuff like that. I mean, just there's been um, sake brewers have long embraced science and technology. I mean, before there's more superstition and stuff like that because they didn't have as much kind of like clear data, let's say. But like the thing that hasn't surprised me this year is when the pandemic started, sake brewers are very quick to cancel events. And then they were also very quick, a lot of them were to go online and hold events. And there was a certain alacrity there and a certain, I guess, flexibility that you don't quite see with large companies in Japan. And I think that a lot of that, and this is kind of a big theme of the book, is that these are family businesses. So there isn't this layer of kind of middle management. It's where you have the people that that own a lot of these breweries are making it themselves, and so they can look at their product, they know their market, they're quickly able to assess the situation, and they're able to, in good years, respond to trends and demands. In bad years, say like, okay, we have to change what we're doing, and we need to do these kind of Zoom tastings or introduce our brewery online or all these different things that they were able to do with a lot more speed than I saw in other industries within this country.
Yeah, let's give some types, sake types, because when I first came to Japan, I had no idea there were so many different varieties and so many different styles of sake. And I think your book introduces so many of the different styles really well. Could you just give a basic introduction of the types and styles?
Sure. I mean, the kind of the basic categories that we have will have either sake is pure ice, junmai shu, or it has either added alcohol, which would be like honjozo, or it has added alcohol and then other stuff, which would be futsushi or table sake. And then we have sake that's categorized by polishing rates. So for ginjo, that's going to be 60% or under. For dai ginjo, that's going to be 50 or under. And then you have them separated by yeast starter styles. So you have like kimoto, and they have these little tubs, and they have men or women using these kind of poles to kind of mash up the starter. And then they have Yamahai, which doesn't do that, and that's in one starter tank then. And then there's other kind of like niche styles like, Bodaimoto, which is also called Mizumoto, which is a much more acidic style. The most common style of starter is called Sokujo, and they add the lactic acid instead of creating the lactic acid like they would in Yamahai or Kimoto. So those are kind of the base. And then there's also like Nama, which is, is what we were talking about earlier, where you have like unpasteurized sake and stuff like that. So there's these are kind of the basic styles. One of the things that I thought was interesting that we did in the book is we didn't, for the tasting notes, we separated them all by body. And so we said these are light sakes, these are medium body sakes, and then these are, full body sakes. And I think that for me, increasingly, that's a better way to talk about sake. Because when we start talking about body in a sake, then you can be like, oh, I'm having, maybe white fish tonight, so I'm going to need something that's lighter. Or I'm going to have a steak, so I need this really kind of robust, full body, savory sake. And one of the things that I think can be daunting for newcomers isn't just all the kanji everywhere. There's all this jargon. And the front of the bottle, and sometimes the back of the bottle, it looks like a baseball card. You just have all these stats. And if you don't know what that means, just walking into a sake shop is incredibly intimidating.
And not only that, most of them have beautiful kanji only labels. So
right.
Can you even read them? I had a beautiful sake last night. I had to really work hard to read the kanji, and I've lived in Japan for more than 20 years.
Right. Yeah. It's funny. I remember I was at a sake bar once, and a person was sitting next to me, and I was drinking Jikon, which is a very famous brand. And the person next to me was Japanese, and they couldn't read it. They couldn't read. They're like, "What's that?" Oh, this is. And they're like, "I can't," And that person didn't know that brand. So sometimes, like, you have to know the brand, and it's like, "Oh, this is how you read it," or this, because sometimes they'll use kanji that are slightly more obscure. The way that the letter is more obscure. A lot of the times, though, it's pretty common. You kind of see the same same ones over and over and over again. So it's not so bad. But some of the calligraphy can get very stylized as well. But I think that for foreigners is the most daunting thing. But I think for foreigners and for Japanese people, all the stats, all that kind of stuff. When you see a sake that's saying that, oh, we use this yeast, well, that's requiring knowledge of what that yeast is. So that's assuming that you know what that means. Or if they say like, oh, the polishing ratio for this is 88%, and it's like, well, was that good or bad? And the polishing ratio for this is 23. Well, that's lower, so maybe this is better. And it's like, well, it doesn't quite work that way. It's not that simple.
Yeah. Basically, if you can check my basic sake knowledge right now, most sake should be drunk fresh. And that's where the sugidama display comes into effect, right? Like they make the sake, they hang the green ball, the sugidama, and as the sugidama changes color, people know the age of the sake, is what I've heard. Is that basically true?
You can do whatever you want.
And they have aged sake too, which I found from your book, which I was very surprised.
Yeah, you can. I think that the sake industry should try to avoid a lot of the same baggage, kind of the decorum baggage that we find in other alcoholic drinks. So do what you want. Seriously, do what you want. If you want to, if it's something that's if it's a nama, like you're gonna, it was kind of, I'll say that's kind of created with a certain intent, But even then, like you can take a nama and you can heat it up, and it might be even better. There's a great summer sake called Icebreaker that is great hot, and it's intended to be drunk cold, but like even the fellow that makes it will tell you this is great hot. So I think that people should, if you want to age stuff yourself, if you get a junmai and you just want to put it in the closet, just check on it in 5 years, do it. I think that that the thing that just drives me nuts sometimes, to be honest, is that for Japanese food, it is so seasonal. So we go from winter to spring to summer to fall, and we have food served at certain temperatures to match that. But increasingly in Japan, it's been that you'll see people in the coldest days in spring drinking cold sake. Like you'll see them maybe at like a hanami, like outside, like shivering, and it's like that might be better if it's at room temperature or warm. I mean, just to meet the season, And when we get into summer, let's drink cold stuff. When we get into fall, let's drink room temperature. The way that it's served, I think, should better reflect the seasons than a lot of let's drink it out of the refrigerator.
That's a really good point. And going through your book really made me think, I want to drink some sparkling sake because you can keep it ice cold. Mm-hmm. Of course, regular sake as well. You can keep it ice cold in the fridge. But that was a revelation to me a few years ago when I discovered sparkling sake. And I discovered the maker was saying, make sure, if possible, you drink the sake with the water that it was made from at the same time to hydrate, and then you appreciate the taste of the sake better. And I thought that was really cool.
Right.
Okay, are we at the 1 more minute about sake, and then we're going to switch to whiskey. Anything we haven't touched on? So much.
It's huge. It's a huge topic.
Your book is a great reference. What a great guide.
Well, thank you.
For anybody trying to get into the world of sake. Let's just touch really briefly on brewers abroad. Yeah. You had focused on, because of course fresh sake is delicious, and it makes sense if you're going to drink fresh sake that you should be where it's made, right?
Yeah, well, I think for foreign sake is never going to catch on internationally if foreigners don't make it. Just the same thing with whiskey in Japan. So, it's just key for the success of sake internationally if people in New York or Oregon or Mexico or France or wherever are making it, because that then makes sake a much more familiar product, and it gives people certain closeness. And I think, we see that with Japanese wine. I mean, but before that, wine was popular in Japan. But I'm just saying that brings people a little closer to it. And I think Japanese whiskey is a great example of that.
Yeah, fantastic. And there's so much great information in your book. You go through all the lots of labels at the end. There's a really great reference guide. I can't imagine how much research time that took. Really well done.
Yeah, so that was I worked on this book with a sake sommelier. His name is Takashi Eguchi, and we were very intent on having lots of pairings, and we didn't just want it to be Japanese sake with Japanese food. We really wanted to open it up, and we really wanted to talk about the different temperatures. If you drink it at this temperature, this is how the flavor profile is going to change. So even though I think there's 101, 102 tasting, maybe slightly more than that, tasting notes in the book, one tasting will talk about different, because it changes. The profile of the sake will change. And then we might say like, or he might say, oh, this is recommended cold, or this is recommended, at room temp, or this is recommended hot. So in that way, it's really, really practical. And I think that writing about sake that way really helps people kind of open up their mind, and they're thinking about, like, this is a very flexible drink. And if you have one bottle, you can do a lot with it. So
that's great. Yeah, so much great information in there. I'd recommend people finding it. Where's the easiest place for people to get it? Amazon?
Amazon. It's, if you're in Japan, it should be at bookstores that carry English language books, and other online retailers as well. So
yeah, there was one article in the sake book about a sake brewer who also brewed whiskey.
Oh yes.
So
yes.
That might be a great transition. Do you want to?
Right. Very smooth. Yes. So we were talking, and also you're in Hiroshima as well, right?
Yes.
So that is obviously Taketsuru. That he is considered one of the fathers of Japanese whiskey. He is from Takehara, and he then came to Osaka. I went to Osaka University, and after that, he worked at a company in Osaka called Setsu Shizo. And at that time, whiskey was becoming more popular in Japan. It was starting to become, it wasn't a mainstream drink, but drink makers were like, this might be the next big thing. Or, this might have a market, or, people might want to drink this. And whiskey came into the country through the Americans. The Americans brought it in. And when Perry rolled up with cannons, he also had casks of whiskey, and Japanese bureaucrats drank it and got wrecked. They got hammered on it. And then after that, whiskey was imported in to Japan for foreigners. And at the turn of the century, started seeing kind of upper class people that had either had connections abroad or just were interested in foreign things, drinking it. And then Setsu Shizo, this company, said, okay, to Taketsuru, you're going to Scotland, because he could speak English. And so he went to Scotland, and he kind of rolled up on distilleries saying, hey, I'd like to learn how to make whiskey. And they said, all right, we'll teach you. Obviously having no idea that decades later, Japan would become this powerhouse, and he'd become this great whiskey maker. And the funny thing is that he went to one distillery, and the distillers there were interested in kojikin, because there had been stories before that could be used to malt the barley in a cheaper way. And so he had some sent from Japan to Scotland, and they tried it, just didn't work. He said the result wasn't any good.
Can
So
you just quickly explain koji? It's
oh,
the
koji, yeah. So when you're making whiskey, you have the barley, and you need to trick the barley into thinking it's spring. So the barley starts to sprout. Okay, so that's malting it, and then you stop it. So either you blow hot air on it, or you take blocks of peat and you have that smoke, and that stops it. So that's why some whiskey has that kind of peaty, smoky aromas, and why some Scotch whiskey or just whiskey does not. For when you're making sake, you can't do that with rice. There's not enough sugar in rice. So you take the koji cane and you inoculate with that, and you create koji, because you need sugar for the yeast to make alcohol. If you don't have that, if you don't have that mechanism, you're not going to get alcohol. So there was a story. There was an idea that koji cane that could be used for barley, and there was attempts and stuff like that. And obviously, when making whiskey, malting the barley then was much more physically demanding. So if they were looking at if they thought they could do it cheaper and faster and better, then they would do that. So this Scotch whiskey maker was interested in that. They had some sent in from Japan. Just Taketsuru said it didn't work as well. So I think maybe Taketsuru, he was very much a traditionalist, and I think that he didn't. I haven't heard him say this, but I don't think he wanted to go there and change Scotch. to be honest, I think he wanted to go there and learn how his beloved Scotch was made, and then come back to Japan and make great whiskey. So I think his designs were different. So then he came back. Setsu Shizo decided that it couldn't. Decided not to go into the whiskey business. Taketsuru ended up with Tori, the guy who founded Suntory, and then they opened up the Yamazaki distillery. They broke ground in 1923, and then you start having the production of actual whiskey in Japan. Before that, you had kind of fake whiskey being made in Japan. Then you had the production beginning of actual whiskey in Japan. And I think the thing that's interesting is that now Japanese whiskey is lauded all over the world. It's a really famous drink, and it's very desirable and expensive, and it has this kind of alluring quality to it. People associate it with quality and great whiskey. It wasn't like that always. I mean, after Prohibition ended, Suntory was trying to get its stuff into the U.S. They tried for years. I mean, they were trying in the 60s. There was billboards going up with like a woman in a kimono holding up a bottle of Suntory whiskey, really trying to appeal kind of to the kind of the Japanese cultural elements of the whiskey. And people in the 50s and 60s in the West would say, hey, this is actually good stuff. But it wasn't until much later that it just exploded like it has now, which is what I think for foreign sake makers is interesting. I think for them, this is kind of, I don't think it's a one-to-one case. I don't think it's something that, we just do what they did and then it'll work. There's so many variables and there's a lot of differences. But I think if anything, it should be a inspirational tale. And where that I think the Japanese, if you talk to a lot of really great Japanese whiskey makers, they still hold Scotch in this high regard. And I think if anything, that really propels them forward to make great whiskey. Just as you talk to sake makers in foreign countries, and they love Japanese. I mean, it's the same thing, and I think that pushes them forward. And then when you start getting these two big segments kind of competing, you just end up, as a customer, you just end up with fantastic stuff. So
you've got this great quote in the book from Shinji Fukuyo, who's at Suntory. And he says, we've done things that are new and not traditionally done in Scotland.
Right. Yeah, without a doubt. I mean, you're talking about kind of the crossover with, let's say, some of the the way things are fermented, or the kind of wood. We're talking about that, and I guess aging as well, for whiskey. So in in sake, kind of the wood that's used is sugi, right? And Yoshino Sugi in Nara is like the, at least in the Kansai area, that's the wood. That is the wood that has traditionally been used and is held in this high regard. Whereas for Suntory, which is also in Kansai, which is in Osaka, they were thinking like, well, we have this kind of inexpensive whiskey blend, Tories, and if we put some spirit that has been aged in sugi, which is not done in Scotland, because it gives it a very, very sharp, I mean, there's more regulations about kind of the woods, that can traditionally there's been more regulations about different kinds of woods that can be used abroad, but in Japan they don't have those, so there's a lot more flexibility. So they thought, well, if we use this wood, we can get this kind of sharp kind of top note that if you add in carbonated water and ice, it's going to make a really pleasant highball. So one of the things that for me is summertime, I really enjoy highballs, and the highballs that I want to drink are not expensive Japanese whiskey. It's the cheapest stuff, because a lot of it's specifically designed for that, and so much thought has gone to it. But yeah, they do all sorts of like interesting stuff in Japan. I mean, they're the ones that had like a coffee still, which is a still that's traditionally been used in the UK, and they were like, let's run malt through it, all sorts of stuff. So
I love that part in the book when you're talking about the best whiskey selections are usually in Japanese bars, and about the creation of the ice ball.
Right. Yeah.
I'm showing the ice ball now. It's beautiful. So those are often handcrafted by the bar people, huh?
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
So Tories was the cheap version for Suntory, was it? I've got an old poster from your book here for
Right.
Tories.
I mean, it was kind of like an everyman brand, and they had these Tories bars that really took off in the years after the war, and the Japanese military and the war, obviously that was awful, but one of the maybe unintended side effects, or kind of was that it really led to the rise of a whiskey culture among regular folks in the years that followed, because you started seeing during the war, the government enlisted distilleries to make raw materials for the war, but they were also having casks of whiskeys come in for the troops. So I think a lot of people started drinking whiskey then, and then after the war, whiskey became a very aspirational thing that regular people could drink. And I think that within the country, that's when you started really getting a strong whiskey culture. That, I mean, didn't quite before that. It was a lot more exclusive. But after the war, especially the rise of these bars, it became something aspirational that you could still afford. So
Yeah, there's a lot of great examples, of course, and a very detailed guide to all the different regions and distilleries around the country. There's actually a lot. How many are there in Japan?
well, the cool thing is that when I wrote that book, there was actually a smaller number of them, and since then there's been more distilleries opening and stuff, and for years before the Japanese whiskey became really popular, again in Japan and then internationally, it was really on the downslide. It was really grim. I mean, there was a time that you could roll up to the Yamazaki distillery. They'd sell you a cask, not a bottle of whiskey. They would sell you a cask. You could buy a cask. And now, like walking out of there with like a bottle of like Yamazaki is you feel it's like finding a unicorn. Sometimes you go into the distillery shop there. It's picked clean usually. The bar downstairs there has really nice stuff. So it's great. And what's happening now with regards to Japanese whiskey is very interesting, because traditionally we've had these two titans. We've had Nikka, and then we've had Suntory, and then we've also had other big companies as well. But these are kind of the two mainstays, and these are companies that are just going head to head. And I forget who said that, but I remember somebody talking about just Japanese business and saying, like, if you think Japanese business people are rough towards like foreign companies, you should see how they go after each other. You know what I mean? And so they really, really competed with each other, and still do. I mean, it's to the point where like people will, Sundry people will, obviously they don't hate people. I mean, there are so many events together. I'm sure they're friendly and stuff like that. But if you go into the Suntory Museum, there's a photo of there with like the first, like it's a commemorative photo with all the workers, and they're holding like the first bottle of whiskey to come out of Yamazaki. And in the middle of the photo is Taketsuru. And he worked at this company, and then he left. And he made like Nikka, he made the rival company. And if you read the subtitle, it's like workers at the Yamazaki distillery with the first bottle of Yamazaki. His name is not in there, And that's just, that's corporate Japan. That's how it works. So because of that, it's meant that these titans of Japanese whiskey had to be very self-sufficient. So they had to procure their own casks. They weren't trading spirit between each other. They built distilleries in different regions to get different flavor profiles and different styles. But now with the advent of more distilleries and smaller distilleries, that doesn't exist. And there's a much more like, we're working for the good of Japanese whiskey. So I think that in that way, the industry will change. And for, if you like Japanese whiskey, that just gives you a lot more options, and it makes me really excited. I mean, obviously Suntory and Nikka are incredible, and they make incredible things, but then you start getting just different takes, different people, different ideas, and willing to experiment with different stuff. And I think that just the industry then benefits greatly.
Have you noticed that in the world of sake? Is it more collaborative than competitive?
I think so. The thing with sake is that there were these scandals several decades ago where you had kind of the really big companies, and they had other smaller breweries making stuff for them, and then they were rebranding it and selling it as their own. And this was just like this huge kind of scandal. And from that point, the sake industry, I think, just gradually started becoming more and more open. And so when I was kind of worried, like I would call up breweries and stuff, and I would be like worried, like I would think that, oh, this is like a really old brewery. Their Toji seems like this really intimidating person, da 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 da. And you go there, and it's incredibly open. And there's this whole spirit, especially like within like regions, everybody knows each other, and then generationally, there's a whole generation of brewery owners who are also Toji, who are in their late 30s and early 40s, who are just kind of really coming into their own and making really popular stuff. Well, they're all friends, and they go on vacation together and they hang out and stuff like that. So there's a much more I don't want to say like collaborative, but it feels like this much more cohesive. Like a lot of people, obviously they're competing, they want to sell their stuff, and they have a lot of pride in what they're doing. But it was that industry was a lot more open than the whiskey industry. The whiskey industry in Japan still felt like it had a lot of secrets. The sake industry didn't quite feel that way, and that was something that I was really surprised. And I thought that uh, you know, as I said before, I visited well over 100 breweries. Maybe once or twice there was like a weirdo, like a brewery, like the person who owned the brewery had these like weird demands, or like you have to show me what you write before you publish it. It's like, I'm not doing that, and they'd be like, you have to, and it's like, no, and like everyone else is like super cool. It's like, you want to come see the brewery, see what we do, like, come here in the morning and you can stay all afternoon and see how we work, and we'll show you it. And it was just like, wow. And there's this sense of just pride, like this is what we're doing, this is how we do it, this is what we make, and we think it's great, and I think that that's inspiring.
That's great. I love this story of the lions on the distillery, and how the locals who work there talk about it as the shishi, as the protective creatures, not the British lions.
Right. Yeah. That's, I mean, there's a so when writing about Japanese whiskey, especially comparing to Japanese sake, you cannot separate from Japanese history or culture. It's just, you open up the Kojiki, it's like we're talking about sake. You know what I mean? They're just glommed on that. You just cannot separate them. And so sometimes when people write about Japanese whiskey, they kind of shoehorn stuff in, and it becomes almost like Orientalism. It just becomes bizarre. And that was one of the things that I was, when I did the whiskey book, really, really careful about. If we're going to talk about cultural things, well, let's go to like a religious event that Suntory holds, at the shrine right behind the distillery. These kind of like actual cultural things, not just like kind of odd comparisons with other things in Japanese culture. But yeah, I mean, that's the thing that's so interesting to me about Japanese whiskey is the first Japanese whiskey that was made in Japan is called White Label. The second whiskey that was made in Japan is Red Label. And you just look at the designs and the colors. From the beginning, there was this idea, this awareness that we are making Japanese whiskey. And then the big question becomes, well, what is Japanese whiskey? The vast majority of barley that is used to make it is not from Japan. The vast majority of casks in which whiskey is made are not from Japan. Most of them are going to be from North America or Europe. And then we're going to have a very small number of casks that are made from Japanese oak. So then what is it? And the best answer is what the founder of the Chichibu distillery told me, is that Japanese whiskey is whiskey made by Japanese people. And I just think that when I heard that, I was like, wow, that's a great answer.
That's an awesome answer. Yeah, and why not? I mean, companies abroad are using Japanese techniques in what they do, but they own it because they're making it there. And I think in terms of sustainability too, if you're employing local people, you're doing it with your own methods. Even if you imported the actual distillery or whatever, you import some of the source material. We live in a very global society. Even in Japan, we're very dependent on international resources. So I think that's a great answer.
Yeah, but I mean, with regards, I mean, for you, I mean, this probably might be really interesting, is that during the Meiji period, there was a Meiji Taisha period. There's this massive building in Japan, and especially, expanding up into Hokkaido and all this other kind of stuff. And so they had all these Japanese oak trees, Mizunara trees up there, that had just been growing, and so they just went through and just cut them. They just went through and cut a lot of those down. If you're going to make a cask, a Western style cask, you're gonna want oak, and so they started using Japanese oak. Japanese oak uh, has become very, very expensive because of all of the deforestation that was done years and years ago, and it takes 150 years for the tree to reach a size that they can get the proper wood to make cask staves out of. The thing though is, and so like you get a slightly different flavor profile from Japanese oak as well. But the thing is, Japanese oak is terrible for casks because when you cut American white oak, the wood kind of protects itself, and these kind of like basically the simplest way to explain it's like these, it's like almost like airbags, like these kind of bubbles like go up in the wood, so you get these almost like waterproof pieces of wood. That doesn't happen to the same degree with Mizunara. And so if you have 10, let's say, American white oak casks, if one of them leaks, that's like, whoa, that's like a big deal. So the expectation is they're going to be, none of them are going to leak. If you have 10 Mizunara casks, all 10 of them are going to leak. You're going to end up with like spirit all over the floor. And so compound with that the fact that coopers like have to compete with furniture makers as well, and they have to get the best wood to make casks. Furniture makers can get stuff with knots in it and all kind of, they have to get the best pieces of wood, so it's really, really expensive. As Japanese whiskey has become more and more popular, whiskey or spirit that's been aged in Mizunara has become more and more desirable. And so it's just kind of, it's made it, and so now you'll see like there'll be some, some foreign companies will try to age stuff in Mizunara as well. But that kind of stuff for me was one of the most interesting aspects about writing that book.
That's fascinating. And it shows that, if you stick with local resource, it's kind of your differentiation in terms of marketing as well, right?
Right. But I mean, if anything for whiskey, the different, like 70% of the flavor is from the cask. So if you have more different types of wood, we have American white oak, we have European oak, and then you bring in Japanese oak, then you have a new flavor. So it really kind of expands the palate. And if you distill a spirit in Japan, you age it in American white oak, you're going to get a different whiskey than if you distill a spirit in Scotland and then age it in American white oak as well. I mean, that kind of like local, the climate is just a huge impact on maturation. So it's really, really interesting.
Wow. What is the future of the industry? We have 2 more minutes. Can you just tell us some of your forecasts
Sure.
for whiskey and sake, if you can?
Sure. I think that going into this year, I think everybody was really excited, and I think sake was very much on the ascension export wise, and there's a lot of interest in sake outside of the country, and Japanese whiskey just keeps kind of just like going through like gangbusters. But I was expecting in January. I was expecting like, oh, we're going to get a lot of really interesting kind of limited premium Japanese whiskey releases for the Olympics, and there's going to be a lot more stock on the shelf. I thought like, maybe we'll be able to walk into a liquor store and easily find a bottle of Yamazaki 12. I was in the liquor store a few days ago, and there's a sign that says, we're getting in 10 bottles, and you can enter a raffle for a chance to buy one of them. And this is like a standard release. This is not a special. So that was kind of, I think with obviously the pandemic and stuff, that's kind of, with the Olympics being moved, all of that's kind of been thrown out of kilter. Then for sake, as we were talking about before, with consumption going down in restaurants and bars, obviously, it's really gonna, it's already impacting things. And I don't know what the future, I would say kind of the benefit for whiskey and kind of the detriment for whiskey is it takes time. So if you distill something, you need 3 years at least before you can call it whiskey. Well, they can look at stuff like now and like, wow, it's awful now. We'll just put this aside, and then we'll sell it in a few years, and we'll have a whole range of stuff. For sake, for a lot of the products, it's kind of like it's we make it, we sell it, we make it, we sell it kind of business model for a lot of it. So it really comes in and hurts them. I think that obviously once things return to normal, there's going to be a huge desire for people to go out and to drink and to socialize and be with other people as well. And I think that we're going to see like a huge rebound on stuff. What I'm worried about is from now until that point. And we're going to lose people. We're going to lose restaurants. We're going to lose bars. We're breweries and stuff like that. But for me, that's really, really worrying. This period. I think the period when it's like, okay, you can go out and you don't have to worry about getting sick, and there's a vaccine and stuff. We're going to see just a huge rebound, but until it's going to be rough.
So, in terms of longevity, maybe the whiskey companies have a bit more security because what they make could be sold more in the future, whereas sake has always been make and sell quickly kind of life cycle of the business. So a bit more in danger, you think?
It depends on the sake brewery. So if you have a brewery that still is making sake that is really widely enjoyed and sold locally. So the local people, it's like, this is our sake. And that's what they go and they buy and they drink it. I think they're going to fare okay. And then you have to look kind of like at the brewery's business. So a lot of these breweries are doing, the big ones are doing, kind of like biotech stuff as well, cosmetics. Some of the other ones, it's like they have a real estate business. They have different, the breweries are owned by people with traditionally that have money, right? These are like families that have been wealthy. So they may have other businesses, just depending on the brewery, right? Some of them might be just a total mom and pop thing, and that's their only gig, and they're just scraping by, and they're going to have, if they're supported by their local community, hopefully they'll be okay. So it really depends. Is this a brewery with a lot of diversified portfolio? Is this a big company that's already taken a big hit and is doing all this other stuff? Or is this one that's only done sake? And then if you look at the ones that have only done sake, where are they selling it? So if the business model for some of them has been, we're just going to make like local stuff. So I've been into breweries that are here, and their distribution is like just around, and it's great. And you go in there and it's like, dad's doing it, mom's doing it, and the kid's doing it, and that's it. And the people in the community love their stuff, so hopefully they'll scrape through. Some breweries you go to and you see this, they've become much more popular. They've kind of geared towards like, we're selling our stuff to restaurants and bars in Tokyo and Osaka. So we're making stuff that maybe the local people don't really, they don't drink. Maybe it's too expensive. Maybe it just doesn't quite, maybe it's in a style that they don't quite like. Some of those are going to have a rough time, I think, because that kind of business model, the floor's just falling out on. So it really depends. I think kind of big picture stuff, we're gonna, it's gonna really hurt sake brewing. But once we get through the other side, and the thing that's so sad about this year is that, I mean, not only for me, somebody who loves going to like sake events and seeing people and seeing friends and whatever, those are all canceled, and that sucks. Is that there's just so much great stuff being made now. It's just a huge range of stuff, different styles. There's people doing really orthodox stuff. There's people doing really inventive stuff. There's people doing like weird stuff. It's like all these different flavors and styles. And so, as a sake drinker, when you walk into a bottle shop in Japan, and you see stuff on the shelves, it's like, you want $12 for this? Really? Is that it? And you're like, that's crazy. This should be twice this easily. 3 times it.
We got a huge bottle, almost as tall as me, for 1,500 yen. Yeah, it's incredible, incredibly cheap.
Yeah. And so, obviously, people outside the country, they're because of shipping it and taxes and all this other stuff, it becomes much more expensive. But within the country, it's like an embarrassment of riches.
Yeah.
And so
as consumers, how can we help? Is buy local breweries.
Right. Yeah, and so that's the thing, is like, if everyone kind of looks like, these are the breweries that are near me and who I love, or maybe it's like, I've been to this brewery and it's in several prefectures over, and I just I really love it. That helps. It's not going to offset the drop in bars and restaurants, but it helps.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for sharing all your insights from your 2 excellent books. And thank you, people, for joining and commenting. Dan H., Melanie Brock, Molly B., thank you for your comments along the way. And thank you so much, Brian. Have a good day.
You too. Thank you very much.
Thanks, everybody. Take care. Have a good weekend.